Boston held its breath the way a city does before something breaks. By 7:15 on a Tuesday in February, the temperature outside had dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Harborview Tower on Atlantic Avenue wore a skin of ice that caught the streetlights and scattered them across the pavement like broken glass. Inside the building's 52nd floor, Evelyn Carter's penthouse sat in the particular silence that expensive things occupy when no one is watching them. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her driver had radioed ahead that a tractor trailer had jackknifed on the expressway. Her assistant, Dana, had rerouted her from a client dinner in the back bay. By 8:12, Evelyn stepped off the private elevator into the marble foyer of her own apartment and realized with a small, clinical jolt that she had forgotten about the cleaning crew. The man was on his knees near the kitchen island. He was picking up the remnants of a wine glass that must have fallen from the counter, 3 large curved fragments, and a constellation of smaller ones that caught the recessed light and threw tiny prisms across the marble floor. He held a fragment between his thumb and forefinger, turning it slowly, examining the breakpoint. Not to be careful, that wasn't the gesture. He was studying it. His hand was steady in the way that belongs to surgeons, or to people who have long since burned through their quota of nerves in some other life. Evelyn stood in the doorway without speaking. Her coat was still on. Her briefcase hung from her right hand. She had seen that gesture before. That exact rotation of a fragment between 2 fingers, that specific angle of the wrist. In a conference room 8 years ago, a man had turned a glass paperweight the same way, while 47 people waited for him to speak. He had been deciding whether to dismantle an acquisition or salvage it. He had chosen to dismantle. The decision had cost 400 jobs and recovered $120 million for the fund. The man on her floor looked up, not startled, not apologetic. He simply raised his eyes at the sound of her heels on the marble and looked at her with the flat, unreadable expression of someone who had learned to make himself invisible by choice, not by nature. He was perhaps 38. Dark eyes, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 2 days. Wearing the gray uniform of Apex Building Services. His hands were clean despite the broken glass. On the floor beside him sat a small orange safety cone and a folded cloth tools placed with the quiet precision of someone who does not fumble. "I'll be finished in 3 minutes," he said. His voice was low, not deferential, just contained. "Who are you?" Evelyn asked. The question came out more direct than she intended, but she didn't soften it. "Michael Hayes, Apex Building Services. I'm one of the Thursday crew. Thursday is tomorrow." Storm pushed the schedule. "Your building manager approved the change." She looked at him for another moment. He looked back at her without expression. Not hostile, but not shrinking either. There was something in the quality of his stillness that unsettled her in a way she couldn't immediately name. Evelyn Carter had spent 12 years learning to read rooms and the people in them. She knew the difference between stillness born of calm and stillness born of discipline. This was the second kind. "Leave the rest," she said. "I'll call the desk. The small fragments will get into the grout. It's better if I finish." She paused. He turned back to the glass, and she watched the back of his neck as he worked methodical, unhurried, and the small thought arrived and would not leave. She had seen this man before. Not his face, his hands. "Fine," she said. "Finish." She walked to the window that ran floor to ceiling on the north wall, and she looked at the city below. And the thought settled lower in her chest like ice water. Behind her, she could hear the quiet sound of glass being placed into a bag. 3 minutes later, the foyer door opened and closed without ceremony, and Evelyn was alone in her penthouse, with the sound of the wind pressing against the glass, and the particular unease of a question she hadn't yet found the words to ask. The alarm on Michael Hayes's phone went off at 4:45 without drama. He had been awake for 10 minutes already. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a 6-story building in Dorchester, the kind of building where the radiator worked on its own schedule, and the windows required a folded towel at the base to keep the cold from bleeding through the frame. He lay on his back in the dark for a moment, listening to the silence. Outside, snow was falling again. He could tell by the muffled quality of the street sounds the way even the distant bark of a dog came padded and softened through the air. He got up without turning on the overhead light. Sophie's room was across the hall. Door cracked 2 inches. The way she preferred it. She was 9 years old and slept on her side with both hands tucked under her cheek, and she would not wake for another 2 hours. He stood in the gap of the door for a moment and listened to her breathe, a habit he had developed in the hospital and had never fully surrendered. Even 3 years later, when the cardiologists had downgraded her monitoring to twice annual checkups and told him the defect was small, manageable, that she would likely live a perfectly ordinary life. Likely. He had spent considerable time in the years since learning to live in the space that word created. In the kitchen, he moved by memory. Coffee, oatmeal, Sophie's medication and the orange pill organizer on the second shelf, metoprolol, low dose, just enough to keep the rhythm steady. He left her bowl covered on the counter with a sticky note that said dragon fruit is in the fridge. I'll be home by 4. He had been leaving her notes like this for 3 years, since her babysitter, a retired teacher named Carolyn, started watching Sophie after school. He ate standing at the counter. Outside, a plow scraped down the street, its yellow light sweeping briefly across the kitchen ceiling. He had been working for Apex Building Services for 14 months. Before that, 18 months at a logistics company doing inventory reconciliation, a job that required a graduate degree to perform adequately and paid as though it didn't. Before that, 3 months of nothing while the legal process completed its slow and expensive work, and he tried to understand what remained of his life. Before that, 6 years at Langford Capital Management, where he had been a senior fixed income analyst, and then a portfolio manager, and then briefly, disastrously, the man whose name appeared in every second paragraph of a Wall Street Journal investigation that ran across 4 editions in October of 2018. He did not read those articles anymore. He had read them enough times in the first months that he could reconstruct them from memory with near-perfect accuracy, including the pull quotes in the headers, including the photograph they had used, a company headshot from 2016, before everything, when his suit had fit and his expression held the specific confidence of a man who believed that his intelligence constituted a kind of protection. He rinsed his bowl. He packed his work bag. He stood for a moment in Sophie's doorway, and she breathed steadily in the dark, and he turned and left for the bus stop at 5:11, walking through the snow with his collar up and his hands in his pockets, and if he felt the cold as an injustice, he did not show it to anyone. There was no one to show it to. That was, in its own way, a mercy. The 43rd floor of the Carter Holdings Tower in the financial district was a different kind of cold. It was the cold of controlled air and stainless surfaces, of floor-to-ceiling glass walls that looked out over a gray sky and a gray harbor, and a city that moved 16 stories below, with the indifference of something that had stopped waiting for permission. Evelyn Carter sat at the head of a conference table and looked at the acquisition summary laid out before her and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the specific sensation of not being sure. Her father, Robert Carter, had built Carter Holdings from a regional property fund into a diversified investment management firm over the course of 30 years. He had died of a coronary embolism in his office on a Monday morning 18 months ago, at 61, before he had adequately prepared his succession plan. Evelyn had taken the chair not because the board had unanimously chosen her, but because no one had found a more credible alternative before the auditors arrived, and she had performed well enough under pressure that the uncertainty had gradually calcified into consensus. She was good at this. She was better than good. She was thorough in the way that people become who have spent years being underestimated, which meant she checked things twice and once more. And she did not celebrate early. The acquisition on the table was a portfolio of 11 mixed-use properties across Boston, Providence, and Hartford, held by a consortium called Hartwell Development Group. The valuation was $412 million. The numbers in the prospectus were clean. She had reviewed them herself, and her CFO, Dennis Howell, had reviewed them again. The board was asking her to move within 60 days. It was, Dennis had said in the pre-meeting, a clean deal. Evelyn said nothing to that. She had learned long ago that the language of cleanliness, clean deal, clean books, No complications was the precise vocabulary of a document that hadn't been looked at hard enough. She turned to page 41 of the prospectus, where the Boston waterfront properties were itemized. And she looked at the comparable sales figures in the appendix and felt the small, cold tickle of something not quite right. Not a number that was obviously false, a number that was plausible entirely, carefully plausible in a way that required the reader to accept two prior assumptions that were themselves not stated. The comparable sales, cited as market evidence, were dated, and the dates were not flagged, and the properties themselves, she would discover this 2 weeks later, when she pulled the registry filings herself, had last transacted in a market cycle that bore almost no relationship to current conditions along the Boston waterfront. She put the page down. Outside the glass wall of the conference room, her team moved through the open floor. 3 associates, 2 analysts. Dana at the corner desk with her headset. The city behind them, gray and white, and still heavy with last night's storm. The harbor reflecting nothing. On days like this, the water and the sky became the same color, and the horizon line disappeared, and the city sat suspended in a monochrome that felt less like weather and more like a statement about visibility, about how much could be obscured by conditions that looked, from a distance, merely ordinary. Dennis appeared at the conference room door. He was a careful man, competent and loyal, and slightly too accustomed to delivering good news. "Board wants an update by end of week," he said. "I told them, the analysis is ongoing." "The analysis is ongoing," Evelyn confirmed. He looked at the prospectus. "Is there something I should know?" "Not yet," she said. "Let me finish." He nodded and withdrew, and she listened to the glass door close behind her with the soft sound of pressurized air. The sound of a room sealing itself. She picked up the prospectus again and turned back to page 41. Clean deal. She was already beginning to doubt it. She had been in this industry long enough to know that the confidence with which a deal was described as clean was, frequently, in inverse proportion to how thoroughly it had been examined. Her father had believed the Mercer Group was clean. He had trusted the institutional framework that surrounded it, the ratings, the third-party appraisals, the reassuring architecture of documentation, and the trust had cost him $31 million, and she suspected more than a year of his health. He had not talked about it in the last 2 years of his life. He had simply become, in some way she had not then known how to name, quieter. Thursday brought fresh snow and the correct cleaning crew, and Evelyn worked from home. She had moved 3 stacks of acquisition documents to the dining table by 9 in the morning and was working through the Providence property comparables when she heard the key in the service door. 2 members of the Apex crew. She registered without looking up. The sound of equipment being rolled across the tile, the soft percussion of cabinet doors in the utility hallway. At 11:20, she took a call in the study and closed the door. When she returned to the dining room 40 minutes later, she stopped in the doorway. The table was unchanged. She had made clear in her building notes that the work surface was not to be touched. But the stack of documents to the left of her laptop, which she had arranged chronologically as she processed them, had been shifted approximately 6 inches to the right to allow the crew to clean beneath them, and this was the thing, they had been replaced in a different order. Not a random order, not the original chronological order either. They had been sorted by property type, residential first, then mixed, use, then commercial. Within each category, by city. Boston, Providence, Hartford. It was not how she had organized them. It was, objectively, a more logical organization for cross-referencing against the appendix tables. She stood at the table for a moment with her coffee cooling in her hand and looked at the stack and thought, with the slow precision of someone assembling evidence. Someone read these. Not casually. Not the way a person glances at papers while moving them out of the way. Someone had understood the structure of the documents well enough to improve the filing scheme in the 90 seconds it would take to lift and replace a stack of paper. She left the documents in their new order and said nothing. The following Thursday, she set a test. She placed the same stack of documents in a deliberately illogical order: Hartford before Boston, commercial before residential, and went to work in the study. When she came out, the documents had not been touched. The cleaning crew had worked around them with a folded cloth, leaving the stack precisely as she had left it. Someone had understood the test. She was in the elevator that evening, going down to the lobby to retrieve a package, when she noticed the slight hesitation, a 17-second delay between floors 28 and 29 that she had registered before but never examined. She mentioned it to the concierge. He looked at her with mild confusion and said the elevator had been serviced 2 months ago. She said she was aware and asked him to log the delay in the maintenance record. The following morning, she received a building services notification. A sensor in the elevator's cable tension system had been flagged for a minor recalibration. The notation at the bottom of the report read, "Issue identified following resident observation. Confirmed on second review." There was no name attached to the observation. Evelyn sat with this for a long time. Then she pulled the personnel file for the Apex Building Services crew assigned to her floor. Michael Hayes, 38, Dorchester. One prior employer in 14 months. Meridian Logistics. Before that, a 6-year gap in formal employment, with a note that the applicant had disclosed prior involvement in regulatory proceedings and had been cleared. She set the file down. She went back to page 41. The Mercer Group collapse had been, in the analysis of the Financial Times, one of the most precisely executed cases of institutional fraud in the post-2008 era. A real estate investment trust that had inflated its asset valuations over 4 years through a series of circular transactions between shell entities, creating the appearance of genuine market appreciation for properties that had not meaningfully changed in value. By the time the SEC had unspooled the transactions in 2018, the fund had issued $308 million in securities, backed by assets worth perhaps 40% of their stated value. 112 investors had lost money. The fund's managing partner, a man named Gerald Whitmore, had cooperated with federal investigators and received a reduced sentence. His CFO had received 5 years. 2 mid-level employees had been charged and acquitted. One analyst had been named repeatedly in the SEC complaint as a participant in the valuation methodology, but never charged, because the evidence against him was circumstantial, and because, as Evelyn read in the investigative dossier she pulled from her personal files at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in February, his legal counsel had successfully argued that the analyst had flagged discrepancies internally and been overridden. The analyst's name was Michael Hayes. Her father had lost $31 million in the Mercer Group collapse. She did not sleep after that. She sat in the window of the penthouse, with her knees drawn up, and watched the harbor ice, and felt the specific nausea of a coincidence that was too structured to be one. At 6 in the morning she called Dana and told her to clear the afternoon. At 7 she called the building services manager and asked that Michael Hayes be assigned to the Thursday crew through the end of the quarter. He arrived that Thursday at 1 in the afternoon and found her sitting at the dining table. He looked at her and then at the table and understood immediately that this was not about cleaning. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He placed his hands flat on the table, not crossed, not gripped together, just resting. In the way of someone who has decided in advance not to be defensive. "You were at Mercer Group," she said. "My father lost $31 million in that fund." A pause. Not a gap of shame or calculation. A pause of acknowledgement. Of a man absorbing a fact he has not previously held. "I'm sorry," he said. And it did not sound like the apology of a person trying to neutralize something. It sounded like a statement of actual feeling, which was more unsettling. "You're listed in the SEC complaint. You were never charged. That doesn't mean you weren't involved." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The harbor was visible through the window behind him. Gray. And very still. "Tell me what happened," she said. He told her. It took 40 minutes. He was precise and unemotional, which she recognized as the voice of someone who has told a story enough times that it has been stripped of its drama and retained only its structure. He had been the analyst assigned to the fund's secondary market valuations. He had noticed, in late 2016, that the comparable sales data being used to justify the asset appreciations was coming from transactions that, on closer examination, involved entities with overlapping beneficial ownership. He had written an internal memo. The memo had been received by his direct supervisor, a man named Craig Hollander, who had told him that the methodology had been reviewed by external counsel and was compliant. He had written a second memo 6 weeks later. He had been told to focus on his assigned work. In January of 2017, he had sent an anonymous tip to the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower. The tip had been received and assigned a case number. Nothing had happened for 11 months, during which time the fund had issued an additional $80 million in securities. When the SEC opened its formal investigation in December of 2017, the complaint narrative had been constructed, in part, from emails and documents that had been selectively presented, and in the presentation, Michael's objections had been reframed as participation. Craig Hollander had provided testimony identifying Michael as the primary architect of the valuation model. Hollander had received immunity. Michael had spent 14 months in legal proceedings, lost his CFA designation, paid $400,000 in legal fees, and watched his name become a footnote in a story whose actual authors had walked away with considerably reduced consequences. Evelyn listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Why should I believe you?" "You shouldn't," he said. "Not based on what I've told you. But I can give you the case number for the SEC tip. It was filed 14 months before the investigation opened. The date is verifiable." She wrote down the number. "I'm going to check this," she said. "I know," he said. She stood. He stood. He picked up his equipment bag from the hallway where he'd left it. And she walked him to the door. And just before he stepped out, she said, without quite planning to, "My father's name was Robert Carter." He stopped. "He died 18 months ago," she said. He turned and looked at her. And for the first time since he'd sat down at her table, something moved in his expression. Not guilt, not pity, but something quieter and more difficult. Something that looked, in its way, like grief held in parallel. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." The door closed. Evelyn stood in the foyer for a long time. Outside, the snow had started again. She checked the case number that night. SEC whistleblower tip. Reference 2017W-B04872. Filed the 14th of January 2017. Case assigned to the Office of the Whistleblower, Division of Enforcement. Informational only, no formal investigation opened at time of filing. Case number cross-referenced in the eventual 2018 Mercer Group complaint as a prior flag. Noted in a single clause of a footnote on page 47 of a 211-page document. A footnote. She spent the next 4 days with the Hartwell Development Group prospectus, not the summary documents, the source filings. She pulled the underlying property records for all 11 assets in the portfolio public records. Registry of Deeds. Recorded sales history going back 7 years. She cross-referenced the comparable transactions listed in the prospectus against the actual registry entries. On the 3rd day, she found it. 3 of the comparable sales used to support the Boston waterfront valuations had involved a seller entity called Hargrove Capital Partners, LLC. Hargrove Capital Partners had been dissolved in 2021. Before dissolution, its registered agent had been a firm called Crestview Administrative Services. Crestview Administrative Services also appeared as the registered agent for one of the Hartwell Development Group holding entities. It was not proof of fraud. It was the structure of fraud. The skeleton. Prior to the flesh, she sat at her desk at 2:30 in the morning and looked at what she had built and felt the cold settling into her hands, which were spread flat on the desk the way Michael Hayes's had been. She thought about page 41 and the number that was too plausible. And she thought about a footnote on page 47, and she thought about her father's face in the last year of his life, when he would not discuss the Mercer Group loss, because there was nothing to discuss, the money was simply gone. She picked up her phone. She found Michael's number in the building services directory. She typed, "I need to show you something." Are you available this week? The reply came 11 minutes later. Yes. He arrived at 9 on a Tuesday evening, when the snow was light, the kind that falls without conviction, more atmosphere than accumulation. He came in his own coat, not the gray uniform, which she registered as significant in some way she didn't examine. She had cleared the dining table and laid out the property records in the arrangement she'd developed. The Hartwell Prospectus properties on the left, the registry filings in the center, the Hargrove Crestview chain on the right. He stood at the edge of the table and looked at it for a long time without speaking. You found the registered agent overlap, he said. There's more. He sat down and turned to the Hartford section. The 2021 appraisals for the mixed-use properties. Do you have the underlying appraisals, not just the summaries? She had them. She slid the folder across. He opened it and went through 7 pages in 4 minutes, and she watched him read the way she had watched him handle the broken glass on the first night, with the concentrated stillness of someone whose mind is working considerably faster than their hands. The cap rates, he said. They're using a 5.2% cap rate on all 3 Hartford properties. The market average for that submarket in 2021 was closer to 6.8. That inflates the income valuation by approximately 22% on each property. He leaned back. If you're doing that on every asset in the portfolio simultaneously, the gap between stated and real value could be $60, $80 million, possibly more. On a $412 million deal, the structure looks like Mercer, he said. Simpler, but the same logic. Create the comparables. Standardize the cap rate assumptions. Keep everything within the range of defensible, she said. You recognized it because you've seen it before. Because I built part of it before, he said, flatly. Not this, but the methodology. I know how it works. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, the snow continued its gentle fall. She could hear, distantly, the sound of a plow on Atlantic Avenue. If we take this forward, she said, what happens to you? He looked at her. Probably the same as before. I get named in something. I have less credibility now than I did in 2017. I'm currently employed as a building cleaner. My ex-wife's attorney used my employment history in the custody proceedings. Do you have custody of Sophie? A pause. Shared. Physical custody is mine. 70%. So if this goes public, it won't change the custody arrangement, he said. The court finalized it 18 months ago. But it won't be comfortable. She waited. He said, You're asking me if I'll do it anyway. I'm asking you what you want to do. He looked at the table at the map of something that was, if their reading was correct, in the process of quietly destroying the financial futures of whoever ended up holding the bag when the valuations corrected. He looked at it with the expression of someone who had been in this specific moral geography before and knew exactly the shape of the terrain and the cost of the path through it. Sophie's doctor, he said, told me at her last appointment that she's doing well, that the medication is working, that there's every reason to expect her to have a completely normal life. He folded the Hartford appraisal closed. I think about that a lot. He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Evelyn understood it. He was telling her why he had stayed quiet for 14 months in a cleaning uniform instead of screaming from the building's roof. He was telling her what stakes felt like when they were not abstract. I have resources you didn't have in 2017, she said. Legal, financial, institutional. I have a board that owes me. The board wants the deal. The board wants revenue. They'll want revenue more than they want liability. She paused. I'm not asking you to carry this. I'm asking you to help me understand it. He was quiet for a moment. There's a transaction in the Providence section, he said, pulling a page from the center stack. 4th property from the left. The seller of record is a company called Bridgeport Ventures. Look up who incorporated it. She turned to her laptop. Bridgeport Ventures, LLC. Incorporated, Rhode Island. 2019. Registered agent. Crestview Administrative Services. She looked at him. There it is, he said quietly. There's your thread. The SEC complaint was filed in March. 6 weeks after the evening with the dining table and the Providence records. Evelyn's legal team had spent those weeks building the documentation registry records, appraisals, corporate filings, the cap rate analysis, into a submission that ran to 480 pages with exhibits. She had briefed Dennis Howell first, then the board's audit committee, then the full board, walking them through the methodology with the same cold precision she used on acquisition analyses. The board had voted to withdraw from the Hartwell acquisition and refer the matter to regulators, 5-2. The 2 dissenting votes belonged to members who had been introduced to the Hartwell Consortium through a shared intermediary. She filed a separate disclosure about those relationships. When the complaint became public in April, the response from Hartwell was immediate and loud. Their legal team issued statements describing the allegations as retaliatory, the product of a failed negotiation, and a disgruntled former employee with a documented history of unfounded accusations. The former employee was Michael Hayes, whose name appeared in a Hartwell press release 3 days after the SEC filing. She was in a board meeting when Dana walked in and placed a printed copy of the press release on the table in front of her. She read it without changing her expression, finished the agenda item, and called a recess. In the hallway, she called Michael. "I've seen it," he said. He sounded tired, not panicked. The particular tiredness of someone who has already done the calculation and accepted the answer. "Sophie?" she asked. "At school?" "She doesn't know. My legal team is going to issue a statement this afternoon. I want to include your name." "As what?" "As a consultant who identified structural irregularities in the portfolio." "Which is accurate." A pause. "That's a generous framing. It's an accurate framing. Do I have your permission?" Another pause. Longer. "Yes," he said. The statement went out at 4:15. By 5, 2 financial news outlets had run pieces citing Michael Hayes' history with the Mercer Group, the same narrative, the same photograph from 2016. By 6, Evelyn was sitting in the lobby of the building that housed her legal team's offices, waiting for her counsel to finish a call with the SEC, and she was watching the snow fall outside the glass doors and thinking about footnotes. Page 47, 1 clause. 14 months before the investigation opened, a man had filed a tip and been ignored, and the consequence of being ignored had been $80 million in additional securities issued against assets that were worth 40 cents on the dollar. There was a children's hospital 3 blocks from the Hartwell Group's Providence offices. She had noticed it on the site visit in January. She thought about it now for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate. At 8:30, Michael texted, "Sophie is asking why there's news about me. I need to go home." Evelyn typed back, "Go. I'll update you in the morning." She stayed in the lobby until 11. The snow outside had stopped. The street was white and very still, and the city moved quietly through it, and the legal process slow, grinding, expensive, impersonal continued its work in offices and databases and regulatory dockets that no amount of snow could pause. The SEC's formal order was issued in the following May, 14 months after the initial complaint, in a document that ran to 312 pages and found, in its conclusion, that Hartwell Development Group had engaged in a pattern of fraudulent asset valuation, affecting securities totaling approximately $93 million, that the circular transaction structure, involving Hargrove Capital Partners and Crestview Administrative Services, had been designed to create misleading market comparables, and that the consortium's principals had knowingly authorized the use of suppressed capitalization rates to inflate income valuations on 13 properties across 3 states. Michael Hayes was mentioned in the order. Once, in a paragraph near the end that noted the analysis identifying the registered agent overlap had been initially developed in consultation with a financial analyst who had raised similar concerns in prior regulatory proceedings. The language was precise and almost entirely without warmth, in the way of government documents. It said, in effect, he was right this time, as he had been right before. He received a formal letter from the CFA Institute in August. The letter informed him that his case had been reviewed and that his designation could be reinstated upon completion of continuing education requirements and a formal application. He set the letter on the kitchen counter and stood there for a while. The apartment was quiet. Through the window, The August light was the kind that made even Dorchester look momentarily golden, warm, and slightly hazy, softening the edges of the brick buildings across the street, catching in the leaves of the single tree on the sidewalk below. He had spent 14 months in that apartment, looking at that tree through that window, mostly in seasons when the tree was bare. And it occurred to him now with the clean, sharp clarity of something that had been waiting to be understood that the season had changed without him fully registering the transition. Sophie came in from her room, looked at him, looked at the letter. "What's that?" she asked. "Something I used to have," he said. "They're giving it back." She considered this. She was 10 now, and she had the specific gravity of children who have spent significant time in waiting rooms and learned to read adult faces for information. "Is that good?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I think so. Are you going back to your old job?" "No, that job is gone." He picked up the letter. "But I might be able to do something like it, something different." She looked at him with the frank, unsentimental attention that was entirely her own. A quality he had watched her develop from the inside of a hospital waiting room when she was 7 years old, a quality that had frightened him then because it seemed like the product of too much knowledge too early, and that he had come to understand, in the years since, as a kind of resilience she had built herself without being asked to. "Okay," she said, and went back to her room. He stood at the counter a little longer. He thought about the footnote on page 47. He thought about the 10 months he had spent waiting for a process to confirm what he already knew. He thought about the afternoon in the dining room of the Penthouse when he had looked at a table covered in documents and recognized a pattern he had spent 6 years trying to warn people about, and the recognition had been not triumph, but something more complicated, the feeling of arriving, very late, in a room where a fire had been burning the whole time. He folded the letter and put it in the kitchen drawer, where he kept the documents that mattered. Evelyn, meanwhile, had stood before the board and reduced Carter Holdings' projected growth targets for the following 2 years by 12%. She had spent 40 minutes explaining, with slides, why the company had been moving too fast across too many markets without adequate due diligence infrastructure, and that the consequence of this was not failure, the company was sound, but that the pace of growth had created conditions in which a transaction like Hartwell could arrive looking clean when it was not. She proposed 3 structural changes to the acquisition review process: an independent valuation firm for all transactions over $100 million, a minimum 90-day due diligence window, and the creation of a dedicated risk analysis function that reported directly to the CEO rather than to the CFO. The board approved all 3 by 6-1. The dissenting vote came from a board member who had been introduced to the Hartwell Consortium. He resigned 4 months later, before the subsidiary investigation into his prior disclosures was completed. Evelyn did not feel triumphant about any of this. Triumph required a certain altitude above the material, and she was still too close to it, to the memory of her father's face, to the footnote on page 47, to the image of a man sitting at her dining table, with his hands flat and steady, explaining a story that no one had asked to hear, but everyone had needed. In October, the Tweet early a light fall in the second week. Unusual enough to be discussed. She stood at the window of her office and watched it and thought about the word clean and what it actually meant, which was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of honesty, and how rarely those two things coincided and how much work it required to maintain the distinction. The first snow of November fell on a Saturday, light and tentative, barely enough to coat the cars parked along the street. More a suggestion of winter than a declaration. Evelyn drove herself, which she rarely did, to Dorchester. The address was in her phone from the building services file. She sat in the car outside the building for 2 minutes, and then got out and carried a paper bag from the Vietnamese place in the South End that she had found still open at 5 on a Saturday because it was the kind of restaurant that never really closed. The intercom button for apartment 3C had a small piece of tape beside it with Hayes written in a child's handwriting, the letters uneven and earnest. She pressed the button. A pause. Then, "Yes, it's Evelyn Carter." A longer pause. Then the door buzzed. She walked up 2 flights of stairs that were clean and slightly cold, and smelled of old radiator heat, and the particular combination of cooking smells that accumulates in buildings where families live. His door was open when she reached the 3rd floor. He was standing in the doorway in a gray sweater and jeans. And he looked at her, and then at the paper bag, and then at her again. And she thought she saw, briefly, in the half-second before he assembled an expression, something that might have been simple relief. "I brought food," she said. Because it was true, and didn't require explanation. "Come in," he said. The apartment was small. It was also, she registered as she stepped in, very clean, not in the sterile way of spaces that are cleaned for display, but in the lived clean way of someone who maintains order because order is load-bearing. Books on a shelf above the radiator, sorted by size. A child's drawings tacked to the wall beside the kitchen doorway, dated in the bottom corner. A pair of small sneakers by the door, laces tucked inside. "Sophie's in her room," Michael said. "Don't interrupt her." Evelyn set the bag on the kitchen counter. "She can come out if she wants." She began unpacking the bag. Containers of pho, spring rolls, a small package of the sesame crackers she had bought because she didn't know what a 10-year-old liked and wanted to hedge. Michael stood on the other side of the counter and watched her and did not offer to help, which she appreciated, because she was doing something with her hands that she needed to do with her hands, and commentary would have made it worse. "The CFA letter," she said. "You knew about that? I contacted the Institute in March. I didn't tell you because I wasn't certain it would go anywhere." He was quiet. She didn't look at him. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No." She set out 2 bowls. "I know." There was a sound in the hallway, the particular sound of bare feet on a wood floor being walked quietly, which is audible only to people who know what it means. Evelyn did not turn around. After a moment, a voice said, "Dad, who's here?" "Someone I work with," Michael said. "Sophie, this is Evelyn." Evelyn turned. Sophie Hayes was 10 years old and had her father's eyes, the same dark, direct quality, the same tendency toward assessment before expression. She was wearing a sweatshirt with a small whale on it, and her hair was pulled back in an imperfect ponytail. She looked at Evelyn with the frank attention of a child who has not yet learned to perform indifference. "Hi," she said. "Hi," said Evelyn. "I brought sesame crackers. I wasn't sure if you'd like them." Sophie looked at the crackers on the counter. "Those are the good kind," she said. "The ones in the red bag." "Okay." She climbed onto one of the 2 stools at the kitchen counter and picked up a cracker. "Are you staying for dinner?" Evelyn looked at Michael. He made no gesture in any direction, simply waited, which she had come to understand was one of his methods. The deliberate refusal to steer. "If that's all right," Evelyn said. Sophie appeared to consider this with the seriousness of someone being consulted on a matter of genuine consequence. Then, "The pho is better if you put extra lime in it. I'll keep that in mind." They ate at the small kitchen table, Sophie between them. And the radiator knocked twice and then went quiet. And outside the window the snow continued, gentle, unremarkable, the kind that falls without needing to be noticed. Sophie told a story about a project at school that involved building a bridge out of pasta and the structural failure that had occurred on testing day, which she described with the specific indignation of someone whose engineering instincts had been compromised by substandard rigatoni. Michael listened to her with the half-smile of someone who had heard the story before and wasn't tired of it. Evelyn laughed once, a real laugh, caught off guard by the phrase "the rigatoni had given up on itself," and Sophie looked at her with satisfaction, as though this had been the goal all along. After dinner, Sophie went back to her room to finish something. The door closed most of the way 2 inches open, Evelyn noted. Michael washed the bowls. Evelyn stood at the window that looked out over the street, where the snow was thin and the streetlights made everything look slightly warmer than it was. "I've been talking to a few people," Michael said, without turning from the sink, "about returning to the industry. Consulting, initially. Due diligence work. I know a firm," she said. "Harrison and Vance. They do regulatory work. They've been looking for someone with your background. You've been talking to people. I work in financial services. I talk to people." A pause. The water ran for a moment, then stopped. He dried his hands on a dish towel and turned around and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, not defensively, just settled. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't make it complicated," she said, still looking at the street. "I'm not making it complicated. I'm saying your name." She turned from the window and looked at him in the kitchen of his small apartment, with the drawings on the wall and the child's sneakers by the door, and the dim light that made everything look like something worth keeping, and she thought about how long it had taken her to learn the difference between control and trust, and how many things she had organized and optimized and reviewed twice, and still not been able to hold, and how this ordinary kitchen, this unremarkable evening, this man who had stayed right when it cost him everything, was not something she had scheduled or engineered. "I have a board meeting Monday," she said. "Harrison and Vance have a preliminary call Wednesday at 2. I'll send you the contact." "Okay." Sophie likes the sesame crackers. She has opinions about crackers. Good instincts. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost, which was close enough for now. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door, and he walked with her to the hallway. "Don't disappear," she said. Not a request, exactly. Not a question. Something in between, the kind of statement that is its own answer, if the other person understands what it costs to say. He looked at her in the dim hallway of his third-floor apartment, with the sound of the radiator starting up again somewhere in the walls, and the snow just barely visible through the window at the end of the hall. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She walked down the 2 flights of stairs. Outside, the snow was still falling light, unhurried, covering the parked cars and the street signs, and the ordinary surfaces of an ordinary neighborhood with the same thin, even layer it laid over everything. Ignorant of the difference between what a thing had cost and what it was worth, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the cold settle around her, and looked up briefly at the lit window on the third-floor amber against the dark of the building's face, and then she walked to her car, and she did not look back, because there was no need to. Some things did not require confirmation once you had decided to trust them. Upstairs, the light in apartment 3C stayed on. The city moved through the rest of its winter in the way that cities do traffic and transit and commerce, and the 1,000 small negotiations of people living near each other in the cold. The harbor ice thinned in March. The elms along Commonwealth Avenue grew their first cautious leaves in April. Sophie Hayes turned 11 in June and received, from Evelyn, a book about structural engineering that she read in 4 days and left on the kitchen counter with 3 separate pages dog-eared. The SEC order, filed and cross-referenced and entered into the public record, sat in a federal database in Washington, D.C., as inanimate and authoritative as stone. Michael Hayes's application for CFA reinstatement was approved on a Wednesday afternoon in July. He did not celebrate. He called Carolyn, who had watched Sophie through all the difficult years, and asked if she was free for dinner on Friday, and when Carolyn asked why, he said simply that there were people he wanted to thank before he moved forward, and he thought it was important to do that in the right order. Some things take a long time to be true. Some things were true the whole time, and simply needed someone to look at them long enough, carefully enough, to say so. The light in the apartment in Dorchester stayed on.